Record on this computer. Right. So I believe it's recording. If that recording doesn't work, then that's the worst thing that can happen. If it does, then the thing that can happen is somebody else can watch it who couldn't be here. And so I believe most of us know each other, but there are a couple of people who won't know each other. So while it's also secretly a way of me getting to eat part of this sandwich that looks very delicious on my plate while the rest of you talk. If we could spend, say, 30 seconds just saying who we are, because there are, I think I can see at least a couple of people who won't know everyone else, then that might be useful. So I'll start. I mean, I'm going to be talking at the beginning anyway, but my name's Bligh. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Educational Research here at Lancaster University, and I'm one of the two directors of the Centre for Technology Enhanced Learning. And I wonder if other people could introduce themselves in a similar way. Maybe we'll go around the table first.
Hi everyone. It's good to see you on screen and in the room as well. I'm Kyungmee, another co-director of the center, and also teaching in the program called E-Research and Technology Enhanced Learning. So I think I know most of you. Great. See you.
Hello everyone. I'm Olga, PhD student at the Educational Research Department here at Lancaster University. Nice to meet you.
Hi, I'm Sejin. I'm third-year PhD student. I'm working on thesis right now, so it's really great to be here to know something about peer reviewing. So yeah, I'm really excited.
Hello everyone, my name is Xihong, and I'm a first-year PhD student here, and it's nice to know more people here and to learn something about peer review for academic journals. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know if you can see what order you are on my screen, so I'll help. Phil?
Hello, I'm Phil Moffat. I'm a lecturer in engineering at the Royal School of Military Engineering, and I'm one of the alumni members of the centre, so I'm joining you today from windy Kent. I'm an infrastructure engineer and teaching focused lecturer, and Brett supervised my PhD, which I completed last year. Nice to meet you all.
Maria?
Hello, I'm an alumni of the CTEL Center of Lancaster, and I teach at the University of Malta. And recently, I did the Department of Adult Education and Arts and Open Communities. So I'm glad to be joining you today for this seminar.
Lovely, thank you. Meg?
Hello, can you hear me? First of all, I'm not sure.
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So hello, everybody. I'm a PhD candidate in the CTEL program, hopefully submitting in the next couple of weeks. And I am a librarian at the University of Cambridge. So I'm joining you from windy Southeast England. And yeah, so I guess that's it.
Lovely, thank you. And Tendai?
Hi, my name's Tendai Charles. I'm an assistant professor of education at the British University in Dubai. And yeah, I'm new to the team here, so a pleasure to meet you all.
Okay. It might be worth saying that Tendai, you're a director of another Centre for Technology Enhanced Learning, isn't that right?
That's correct, yes, the Centre for Research in Digital Education. We just started literally last month.
And we're looking to form links between our centre and yours, which is how we've had conversations. I think you may have been talking to Kyungmee. So, this is the first in a new series of events. We don't know how they will transpire. So, the centre, as many of you will know, is located in the department, which already runs several series of events, including the main seminar series and things like that. The centre itself also runs events. One of the benefits of our events, for those who turn up in the room anyway, is that for our events we tend to provide lunch. And historically we've had quite a successful series of events called Meet and Eat, where we meet with someone who's written a paper from outside the university. We read it beforehand and we discuss the paper with them over lunch. You'll be happy to know that that's continuing. So this new series is not to replace that. This is a series of events that we're starting up to go alongside that. But this is more internally focused, and it's probably more focused for PhD students and early career researchers. So, and we called it Show and Tell. It was in an attempt to be humorous, and I know that Sejin is appreciating the humour, so thank you, Sejin, for the encouragement. We'll try not to take it too far with the bad jokes over the coming months, but we'll see how we go. And the other bit of context that's important to know is that the centre is involved, or quite a lot of people from the centre are involved in launching a new open access journal. And part of the reason for that is to, I mean, we are going to talk about this more at the end, but basically part of the reason for doing that is to give people the chance to peer review articles, which is a big part of being an early career researcher and being a PhD student. There are other reasons for doing it, which we'll cover later, but that is one of the reasons, to give people the experience of the full spectrum, as it were, of the academic publishing process. And the first thing that was raised, including by some of the people here, was, well, that's all very well and good, but how should we go about doing it? And that is the reason for structuring this first discussion around the topic of peer reviewing for academic journals. So there is a hope that at least some of you, we could twist your arm to do some reviewing when we launch the first issue later. So we already have quite a few papers submitted, ready for review. So this could happen quite quickly. So what we're going to do is, it will go a bit raggedy in terms of, I don't know how closely this timescale will be followed, but there's also going to be the thing that people are eating at the start, things like that. So we'll see how we go. But I'm going to talk for a while, then Kyungmee's going to lead a workshop exercise, and then we're going to come together for a discussion at the end. That's basically the key point, okay? So the key point is I'm going to talk for a while, and at some point I will shut up. So that is coming. You don't have to listen to me all the way through. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, I'll leave for each of you to make your own private decisions. So I know this is a bit small, and I'm going to say that most of my slides are based on me, my experience, because I want it to be a practical workshop, but I just want to talk about how it's viewed to start with. And actually the paper, which is cited at the bottom of this slide and the next slide, is not a bad paper actually, although it's not really written for an education audience. It's written for more of a science audience. But the thing about peer review is it's an important part of academic knowledge production. The way in which we produce knowledge in academia is often through publication. Journal articles are not the only way in which we publish, but they are one of the main ways. And I have to say that to some extent, everything I say here will be relevant to reviewing some of the other ways in which we peer review as well. So I've peer reviewed a book proposal recently. I also peer review for some conferences and whatever. And there are some differences, but actually a lot of it is pretty similar. And many of the differences are quite obvious. But the point about peer review, if you look at the things I've highlighted in red, is about subjecting an author's scholarly work. So somebody has already written something. Often, I mean, early career researchers are more familiar with the writing something bit. This is now sitting at the other side of the desk, and subjecting it to the scrutiny of others who are experts in the same field. And I've highlighted that because often you'll be asked to review something, and you have to understand that a decision has already been taken. So an editor, presumably in most cases, has taken a decision that you are an appropriate reviewer. So you have to take some confidence from that. And part of it is to say you are a reviewer who has applicable expertise. And if you didn't, or if the editor didn't think that you did, then you wouldn't have been asked. And that's going to come up later because it quite often is the case. You'll be asked to review something. You start to read it and you think, I don't understand this paper. And that can be a point at which confidence starts to go. And you think, maybe it's just me who doesn't understand this paper. And I don't think that's a valid way of thinking. I think you have to understand that you've been selected to be a peer reviewer on the basis that at least an editor thinks you should be able to understand this paper. And if you can't, that's probably because the author isn't explaining things well enough. And that's one way to look at it, okay? There are a whole host of broader discourses around this topic area, depending which area you're in. So even for technology enhanced learning, there are different areas, but in different disciplines, it varies massively. But there is a huge explosion of manuscripts. There's a huge explosion of young scholars, particularly. The young generation of scholars is much larger than the previous generation. There's almost an exponential explosion, what's combinatorial explosion going on. And it's resulting in lots of low quality manuscripts being submitted to journals. And one of the ways in which peer review is viewed is as a filter. So the idea being that only good ones get through and actually get into the journal. Now, there's a whole load of side issues there about the fact that there's also an explosion in journals. Now, I'm interested in that, but I'm going to sidestep that for now because it doesn't really affect the peer review process that you're going to be concretely asked to undergo. It does involve an element of trust, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about subsequently, it does stem from the fact that we have to be a bit trusting. Authors need to trust peer reviewers need to trust authors to a certain extent. You're placing each other in positions of power. There are decisions to be made. We need to enter this with a bit of goodwill. And there is another kind of trust, which is that readers need to trust that when they go to a journal, that the articles they read have gone through a process of peer review. So there's a lot of layers of trust here. It is not a universally popular mechanism, and it's often regarded as implicitly conservative. Papers that are innovative or unusual or say something controversial or whatever might get rejected because somebody didn't understand the message that was being carried. Now, again, I'm going to sidestep that a bit. There are a lot of alternative methods and approaches that are being suggested all the time. This is not new. That's been going on for decades. So far, none of them have really stuck. There are slightly variant approaches to peer reviewing that are being adopted. I think some of them have some potential for open reviewing and publishing comments on websites and all kinds of things. But for now, we're going to stick to a fairly routine peer review process, which is still being used in the overwhelming majority of cases and has been for a very long time. So when we want to look at peer review, I think we need to balance two things at all times. One of which is what we've already talked about, which is we are filtering. We are making sure that certain things get through to a journal and other things don't. But that's only one part of the story. And the other part, which I think for the process is at least equally important, and I often view it as more important, I have to say, is we're trying to improve the quality of manuscripts. Okay, we're actually trying to help someone. Okay, we are effectively being recruited to someone else's project and being asked to give our input into it. We're being asked to say, how could your work be stronger? Okay, and the bits that are important in that sentence, we will be unpacking them, but not only how can it be stronger, but how can your work be stronger, right? We're trying to help the other person, not necessarily ourselves. Although you do get academic recognition for peer reviewing, but in the immediate instance, you're trying to help someone else. And if you think about it in those terms, a lot of other questions that people often have, they start to fall away. And I anticipate a lot of questions people might have later might fall away because I'm going to keep saying, you're trying to help someone else. So think, how would you help someone else, right? Now, from this point on, apart from those two slides, most of this is going to be personal. So I was trying to figure out last night, how often do I do peer reviews? And I I set myself I put the deadlines for peer reviews in my calendar. And so I searched for peer review deadlines in my calendar. And it came up with about 85 such deadlines. And I've been here since August 2013. And obviously I had a different calendar at another organisation, so those are no longer searchable to me. But 85 since August 2013, I realised I do about one a month. I have done about one a month for about 7 years. And I have done more than that before that 7 years, but I couldn't trace the numbers. But I have certainly done between 100 and 150 peer reviews over the past 10 years. So that's the basis on which I'm going to draw this experience. Okay. And what happened to me was I started, once I published the first couple of times, I was getting mainly invitations from the journals I publish with. Okay. And then after a few more years, I just started to get random invitations from everywhere. And I'm not going to cover that. We're focusing on the peer reviewers' vantage point, but there must come a point where editors start to see you as someone they approach more often or something like that. So I do now just get random review requests from journals I have not published with, and in most cases I accept them. There are a few where I think the journal is dodgy, particularly if they start forcing authors to pay lots of money, which happens with one journal. I peer reviewed for a journal twice before realizing that they insist that all authors who publish there pay about $1,500 US. And I've rejected every review request from that journal since. So with that in mind, I'm going to say you need three things to do a successful peer review in the basics. You need a manuscript, which is the picture on the left. You need to have some idea about what it is you're reviewing for. Most journals have an aims and scope section. It's the aims and scope section for a journal who asked me to review the other day. That's actually one I haven't published in before. So different publishers put them in different places. All the Routledge ones are in the same place and all the Springer ones, but you'll find them. If it's a special issue, and there are side issues, like you might be reviewing a chapter for an edited book or something, then you'll need to look more specifically at what they're trying to get at in that special issue or book. And the third thing, I'm just going to repeat myself from earlier, is you need yourself. And again, I don't want to hide the fact that this is an expertise-driven exercise. It's a subjective exercise. It's not a reliable exercise in terms of if two reviewers view the same paper, they will come up with different comments and a different outcome. Okay, it is not a statistically reliable exercise. It's a personal one, and we just need to get over that. Okay. So the manuscript, a couple of things I tend to think are interesting. There's one at the bottom I think is really interesting that many other people might think is really boring. But anyway, the manuscript will be anonymized. The author's names won't be on it. So this is part of the blindedness of the peer review. Those of you with a mindset for alternative formats will know that there are occasional experiments with non-blind peer review, but I'm going to ignore that for now. So the authors' names won't be on the manuscript, and they should have also taken out their own citations, or at least made it clear, they've not made it obvious that they're citing themselves. Personally, I think if you spend some time and effort, you can nearly always figure out who it is with some degree of accuracy. When I started doing this, a lot of years ago, I used to find that quite interesting. And I used to make a little bet with myself if I get it right. I have to say that's gone a long time ago. I don't know why. It seems a lot less interesting when you've done it a few times. So I don't bother. But it's really, and I've seen this acknowledged in guidelines and things like that. And I think a book that I read about this topic years ago when I was trying to get into it acknowledged that they had even done some study, and basically you can usually tell. Okay, but does it matter? And in some ways, the point of peer review is to say this is an equal system. If this is a PhD student's first paper, or this is a established prof's 200th paper, it shouldn't matter, except for the fact that if I detect it's a PhD student's first paper, I might be motivated to be a bit more helpful. I don't know. But in principle, it shouldn't matter. They tend to have line numbers added to the page. This will come up a bit later. You can see in the image, that's a bit of an automated process, usually done by some little script on a server somewhere. It's not something anybody's actually done. And usually the line numbers are not very precisely aligned to the actual lines on the page. So it's a bit of a guessing game. But nonetheless, when I'm making comments, I often try to say where I'm talking about. And talking about page and line numbers is a very useful way, and that's why they're there. Okay? But the author hasn't done that. So I'm trying to point out they're often sloppy, but that's not the author's fault. They didn't even see the line numbers. I once saw an author put line numbers on their own manuscript, and then the system had added its own line numbers over the top. That made it very clear what I was referring to, as in, no, it didn't. I'm being sarcastic, and I'd advise authors not to do that. Formats, it's not your job as a reviewer to be bothered about formats, but there are some formats that journals insist on that are not, to me, very helpful as a reviewer. And all I'm trying to say is here, don't blame the authors. Now, if it's a US journal, it will nearly always be in a very definite format like APA. Whatever you think about that doesn't really matter, but the author won't have had any choice is the point for now, whereas in journals from other countries, they're often a bit more flexible. Now, I personally don't often like these formats. I think APA format's dodgy. I don't like the fact that the tables and figures are like 20 pages later than where I want to look at them and things like that. But it's not really the author's fault, and that's the point. So any annoyance, just don't direct it at the author. They didn't have a choice. That's usually going to be the case, okay? And the bit I always find interesting for my own benefit later is that usually a manuscript number, what it does tell you actually, because they're quite honest about these generally, is how many manuscripts that journal's getting. And some of them are massive. So that one, I had some papers from Computers and Education in 2019, but they were in the first half of the year. So but in November 2018, I got a manuscript from Computers and Education with that number, CAE, Computers and Education. I don't know what the D means. 18 is the year, and then manuscript number 1,815. So it's clear that that's in November, right? So that's 11/12 through the calendar year. It's clear that Computers and Education is getting approaching 2,000 manuscripts a year. There are some other journals that send you, and you'll notice actually they haven't had many manuscripts, and you think, oh, if I ever need to put something somewhere in with a bit of haste, I might send that to a specific journal. Now, clearly I'm not naming them at the moment, but there are some journals that get surprisingly few manuscript submissions. That might actually affect what happens after your review with the editor. We'll mention that again later. So the kind of process I go through has those kind of stages. It involves reading, marking up the manuscript, grouping my comments, and thinking about an outcome. It shouldn't be that surprising, although it's not very linear. I'll try and explain it linearly, but it isn't very linear. So, reading. The picture that you're supposed to be able to see on the right, but it's covered by the video of everyone else, is an annotated manuscript from the Middle Ages to show that this has been going on for a very long time. So this is a very, very long established practice. Often I read in books that you should read the paper twice, and I used to. And if you're doing this for the first time, it might be an okay idea. I don't do it myself anymore. I just want to be honest in this workshop in total. I don't do it anymore, but I did used to. The idea being that this is not a very linear process, and things that you don't understand at the start, you might understand by the end, and you might be trying to point out inconsistencies. And so by reading the paper through once and hardly making any comments, and then reading it through twice, you'll at least know where you're supposed to arrive at the end. I think once you get a bit of experience at this, you can just kind of tell the first time. But I did used to do this genuinely, although it isn't many years since I stopped doing it. But that might be something for you to think. Read the paper through twice. First time, scan read, quick read, not really making any comments. Let it wash over you as though you're reading it in the journal. and then the second time you get, and you literally scribble everywhere. So this is my second point. I obliterate the manuscript with comments. They look like a mess after I finish with them. And I often phrase them directly to the author, because when I come to type them up later, I don't want to spend a load of time thinking about how to formulate it. So I often, while it's literally in my mind and I've read the sentence just now, I do spend the extra time scribbling on the side of the paper exactly what I think is wrong with it. When I say scribbling on the paper, yes, you're getting the point, I guess, that I do this on paper with a pen. If you're doing it in Word with track changes or PDFs with track changes or something, then I can't imagine it being very different. But I personally can't peer review on the screen. And I often try to link them directly to a paragraph or line in the manuscript. By that I mean I literally usually circle something and draw a line to the edge of the page and write what I'm talking about. It's directly linked to something. And again, will help you later. So I want to think about this once at a granular level, once. And then later on step back and have all the things in place that I need, okay? And I'm often looking for issues of clarity and structure. Clarity, is this explained in a way I can understand? I'll talk about how you might phrase comments in a minute, but that's the question. Can I understand this? And does the structure make sense? These are the key things that come up with me the most often. There are many other things that come up, but those come up a lot. When it comes to structure, we need to be clear that there are some journals that insist on exact headings. Again, they tend to be American ones, or they can also tend to be the ones that align themselves more closely with the hard sciences. But I don't think that papers always need the same section headings in the same order, unless the journal says, and if that is the case, it should be on their website. And you should look at that at the beginning, as we talked earlier. But you tend to have about 4 sections. There's a beginning bit, and I want to know what the paper aims to accomplish. And the thing is, I'm going to judge at that point whether I think that's a reasonable aim. And then I'm going to let that go. If it's not a reasonable aim, then you can bet your bottom dollar, as it were, that I'm going to say something later. But all I want to do is to understand that aim, because for the rest of the paper, I'm going to be judging them against their own criteria of, did they achieve what they said they were going to? Okay? I'm also looking for them to explain what the problem is. Now that word problem is very promiscuous there, because it could be something very practical. Teachers can't do this in their classrooms, and I'm going to look at something to do with that, right? It could be conceptual. This is happening, we don't understand it. This is the discourse in the literature, I'm not happy with that. A conceptual problem. Or it could be a policy problem. Policymakers, like government, really want to achieve so-and-so, and they're failing to achieve it on practice, or they don't understand how this is happening at the ground level. But there's a definite sense that there's a problem and an aim, and I'm going to set this up now, and we'll do this many times more, but the problem and the aim ought to link. So I want the aim to be good, and I want the problem to be good. I want to understand them, and I want to see how they are linked. So you'll see I'm going to go down. I won't make any surprises on this. I'll go down. There's a list of things, and then I've put this thing on the left-hand side that says that they should all be linked. Okay, so what did I say? Yeah, consistency and flow. The other thing I want to know is that they're not reinventing the wheel. So I want an understanding of prior relevant literature. Whether that's just in the introduction, or whether that's a literature review section, or whether it's a section with the name taken from the topic area, is not really my main concern. But I want to know they've read enough and demonstrate to me that they've read some key papers, so that I know that they're building on something. And that definitely will be brought up later, because when I talk about contributions at the end, it's contributions in relation to that, among other things. Then I want them to explain how they set up the project, how it was conceptualized, might be an explicit theoretical framework, doesn't have to be, what their research questions were. I do insist on research questions. If there are no research questions, there will be a comment to put them in. Okay, absolutely without fail. Theoretical framework can be explicit. The research design, methodology and methods, hopefully people know the difference between that. The broad strategy that links theory and what they're actually doing, and the methods, which is, I did some, say, interviews, and I was interested in questions of, and I want to see them described to an extent that I can understand. Doesn't have to be described to a minute detail because papers have word limits. Then I want them to lay out the findings, and now I'm looking for two things here. Does it plausibly look like, having done all that stuff in the setting up the project bit, that they would have arrived at that? Okay, does that look like that comes out of that project? Because surprisingly often they don't look at all. Sometimes because I think they don't know what they're doing in terms of reporting the findings, but sometimes because they haven't given a very good overview of how they did the project. The problem can come from either direction. And then, have they in some way made these findings appear relevant to the research questions? And some approaches, like, you know, if you do qualitative coding, there's usually a phase at the end where you select codes that in a way that are relevant to your research questions, you know, open axial and selective coding, that kind of way. Not all people follow the same analytical approaches, but we do want the findings to look like they're addressing the research question, and we want the research question to look like a very particular way of formulating the aims. You see what I mean? So at all times, I'm looking for this bit, does it link to the bits before? And then I want the end. I want some conclusions that make sense to me. Okay, again, it's me. This is a personal, non-reliable process, but I want them to make sense to me, who is an expert reviewer, been selected to review this paper. And I also want them to make sense. The key contributions bit is, have you said something back to the literature at the beginning? And if it was a policy-oriented question, you might say something like that again, back to that as well, as it were, and the same for practical and conceptual issues. And I will always be interested in those, but I will never, ever let go of the fact that I want something said back to the literature. So saying something back to concepts or policies or practical stuff depends on how they set up the problem. That's a contingent factor that depends. It's different for each peer review. But saying something back to the literature, I regard that as compulsory. Okay, so they're a bit different. Now, that's a lot of stuff. I'm going to look at some concrete examples, but that's the whistle-stop overview of everything. Now, I just want to make a quick comment about perspective. I'm going to build on the fact that I established earlier that you've been asked to review this paper, not somebody else. Okay, so this is partly about you. I also want to build on the fact that you're trying to help the authors strengthen their work. And those two things are important to bear in mind. There are some other things that I'm never so hot on, like, is this correct in some external way? It can be the case for looking at statistical measures, have they been applied correctly? And if they cite somebody in a literature review, have they actually cited what they said? It's worth checking on that if you don't believe them. But I want to focus on what for me are the more meaty issues of perspective. So I want you to consider your own perspective, because it's one way of getting confidence. Okay, that's the key issue here, is you need to feel confident to actually say what you think and to realize that you are a legitimate voice. Okay, if you don't feel like that, and a lot of people doing their first reviews often don't feel like that, you've got a big obstacle. Now, in one way, there is no magic bullet I can give you to get you over that obstacle. You just tend to, I think the best way is to do more peer reviews and just through practice get more confident. But think about all the expertise that you do have. I mean, if this is a paper about teacher education and you're a qualified teacher, that comes up a bit in our programs, then you know what being a teacher is like. That should give you some insight into what's happening. Okay, if you've read a lot of stuff about this scholarship area before, that should give you an insight. Have you got your views? Okay, and you're not somebody who has no expertise. That's just not who you are. Okay, so you have to see yourself as legitimate. However, and this is the flip side of this is not a place for you to be putting forward your own pet opinions about everything. Okay? You are trying to help the person strengthen their work. And you can say that I didn't understand. That's a very good way of doing it. I didn't understand this. I didn't understand that. Okay? So let's think of a key. This is something that has happened to me that sits at the middle of these two tensions. I might find myself trying to help an author strengthen an argument that I disagree with. Okay? Think of that. This author is clearly making such and such an argument. I think the structure of the paper kind of is okay, but could be strengthened. I do think they're wrong. And I'm just going to help them try and strengthen it. Now, I might say the authors might want to anticipate the objection that in certain places, sometimes that's me saying, actually, that's kind of my opinion. But I'm not saying, oh, I just want this to be rejected because I just don't agree with it. Okay, the author thinks that teachers should be more aware of so-and-so. And as a teacher, I think that's offensive, and teachers are much better than that already, right? I might say, have you considered in the literature that this has been covered from a different perspective? But I'm not going to say, you're just wrong, okay? So we have to put ourselves in the author's shoes a little bit. Conversely, there might be papers I agree with that are weakly written, and I have had to reject papers that are weakly written, that I thought were making, you know, like, I agree with the person, but you just haven't written it in a way that makes sense. So I try to, my opinions matter, but I try to constrain them within certain boundaries, okay? And I often say the authors might consider, or the authors might explain, or the authors might reformulate, or the authors might make the links between this and that sections of their paper more clear, or whatever, okay? This is helping them, but in a way that is really pushing them towards weaknesses that I can see, okay? So these are general principles, but anybody who knows me, which is at least 80% of you here, will know I'm an activity theorist. I get papers that are written from theoretical perspectives totally opposite to activity theory. I don't reject them, okay? I do wonder why the editor thought I should review this sometimes. But I don't just reject somebody who's going for, I don't know, actor network theory or something at the opposite end of the spectrum. But it isn't my perspective. And you just think about that. So you will oscillate between these. Now, at the end, I'm going to end up with a load of scribble. You'll see the kind of scribble in a couple of slides' time. But basically, I'm then going to go through a process of trying to group all that scribble together. And what I find is that I've made a lot of comments that talk about the same thing, or where different parts of the paper don't make sense against each other, links, you know, the kind of links I've mentioned on earlier pages. These kind of things, where I often use a different colored pen, and I put numbers next to my comments, so that issue 2, the number 2 might come up on 4 different pages. And I try to find little groups. And where I can find a group like that, or if the issue is so serious that the paper couldn't go ahead without it, I turn those into what I call the major issues.
So you have some codes.
Yeah. This only takes 5 minutes. It's not like coding data. This is me only coding my own comments. But I try to come up with some major issues, and then the rest I leave as minor issues, and then I have a decision to make, which is next. Because I have to make a decision about what's going to happen. Now, not all journals have the same outcomes. In fact, this is one that's asked me, I just got that screenshot because this is from a journal asked me to review at the moment. And there are those outcomes. They actually separate it. Would you be willing to review a revision of this manuscript? Yes or no? And then they've got 5 kinds of recommendations, and then the boxes where you can put your stuff in. Notice that the comments boxes are usually quite text. They often don't take things like italics even very well. So you'll see in my comments, I often put things with asterisks around them to indicate emphasis. They are usually pretty non-rich text boxes. They're plain text, I think is the word I'm looking for. So I have to think about this, and it's a bit of a two-way thing to think what's best in light of what I've come up with. So if I've got a couple of major points, but mainly minor points, I might say it's minor revisions. They've also got two categories, accept and minor revisions. Could I really tell you what's on that journal's mind when they put those two categories? Not really, because often an editor will choose to accept a paper that you put minor revisions against. So why they've separated out, I don't know. I could guess, but I don't really know. Then there's major revisions where I have mainly a lot of major points to raise. And when that's happening, the point is I'm not going to type out all the minor points, because if that's going to happen, often I'll get the paper back as a second version. And the minor points about particular sentences might well have changed by then because the author's changed the paper a lot. On the other hand, if it's a rejection, I might only state a few major points and leave all the minor points out. I still, when I reject a paper, I'm trying to help the author, because what they're likely to do is to change their paper and then submit it to another journal. And it probably won't be me reviewing it next time, but at least I could help them out and send them on their way. But I will probably only put some major points, and I'll try and constrain it to be 3 major points. Depends. I tend to write between 1 and 3 pages. So I don't know, I think my peer reviews tend to be, I looked at this, the shortest I've ever written is about 800 words and the longest I've ever written is about 3,000 words. But the average is about 12 to 1,400, I would say. So that's the kind of thing we're looking at. All journals reject submissions. In education, we don't pay as much attention to this as in other disciplines, but basically what happens in some disciplines is rejection. If a journal has a low acceptance rate, that's one way of showing it's a high esteemed journal. In some disciplines, I used to be a computer scientist, that would definitely be the case there. They put it on their front page. This journal has an 11% acceptance rate in 2015 or whatever, right? Education doesn't tend to do that. It tends to be only focused on things like impact factors or whatever. But all journals do reject papers. You do have to reject papers. As a reviewer, it feels bad. It can almost feel as bad to reject a paper when you do it the first time as to receive a rejection. But you just have to take the honest decision. You often get this box, comments to the editor. I do use that sometimes. That's confidential and the authors don't see it. I only tend to write a couple of lines in there, but I don't always write anything at all. Okay, now I'll just whip, say for 5 minutes, through some examples which I've done by carving out some text from my reviews. There were quite a few cases where I thought, oh, I wrote a review that had a really good example of where I did this, and then looking through my folders, I can't find it. So I've just gone for some of the ones I could find yesterday and highlighting. But I tend to have 4 sections: an introduction, the major issues, the minor issues, and a bit of encouragement for the author who's just received a review. And I've talked earlier about the fact that the distribution of major and minor issues depends on what recommendation I'm going to make, okay? So that's the structure. The introduction, I just want to say that the 3 paragraphs are from 3 different reviews, so they shouldn't all follow each other. But I always tend to start by saying something positive about the paper, because nearly the rest of the review is going to be everything wrong with it, right? And often there are papers I like where I realized I just had to type a long list of bullet points about everything that was wrong with it. And I really want the author to be clear I do like it. So I'll usually write a paragraph at the start that says something good about the paper, that also says something about the venue. So there's a lot of text there, you can read it if you wish, but the key points are: this is an interesting paper about, it makes a certain kind of contribution. In that case, I think I named 2 contributions, one about knowledge and one about methodology in that case, and it's related to the journal. Because actually, if it's not, that might be a reason for rejection. That's why we looked at the aims and scope at the start. I'm not always that positive. I have to say that the second one is for a paper where I was reasonably negative, but I'll tend to aim to finish the introduction by saying something about my opinion. Now, actually, oh, that's true. So the middle one is a minor revision kind of comment, okay? I do think this ought to be publishable, but I think some revision needs to be made, okay? But I think it's important to set the context in that way, okay? There is something valuable here. It might well be publishable in this journal. I might even say I'm half expecting it will be published, which is kind of nearly what I am saying there. But, and then there's going to be the rest of the review to follow, and then a bit of structure. And you can see that's a paragraph at the bottom with the bullet point. I'm going to basically put the major points first and the minor points last. Okay? The major issues, again, too much text, but I'm going to point out the key areas. The major points are where I type a whole paragraph usually, and those are related to the numbered themes I drew out on my manuscript. And I don't want many of these, otherwise if I've got that many, the paper might be up for rejection. But I do tend to actually type them, and they are a bit thematic. Now in the top one, I think, as I recall, that's an example of where basically the paper isn't consistent. So the links between two areas of the paper are not right. What it says it's going to do at the start is not what it does later on. That to me is a really serious issue. And I'm going to say that, and to almost make, as you can see after the ellipsis at the bottom, because this one was so long I realized I had to cut some out, I make a suggestion. And I say, look, I think what you want to do here is this. See, if the aim is to do this, I'm trying to help the author. I'm trying to think, well, probably what are they trying to accomplish? And this might be a better way of doing it. Okay? So this is a major problem, but the way I'm phrasing it is, this is what the author might want to think about doing. Minor issues look more like that. So they are usually with page and line numbers, and they are nearly always directly transcribed from my handwritten notes. So I will have literally usually written those words exactly in that form on the side of the page and just typed them up. So at this point, there's very little thinking to do. The only thinking to do is how many to do, and I'm one of those sticklers who tends to give a lot. Wouldn't be rare for me, especially if it's a minor revisions, for me to have a lot of these. I mean, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I've got about 12 there on the first 4 pages. Okay, those are in order that they occur in the paper. The major ones are thematic, the order of importance almost. And then a bit of encouragement. I'm well aware that I've provided a fairly intimidating list of comments, and I do hope that it's not too discouraging. I say, I'd like to reiterate that I did think the underlying work had a lot of merit, and I do hope you take the time to work on the paper further. Okay, that's a fairly standard thing. The one in the middle is an odd one that came up. Well, I mean, it comes up basically, but it came up recently. I was sent a paper, I gave it major revisions, and I was then sent it back. And I wanted to accept it, but I couldn't. It still, to me, needs another go round. And that I've had that happen to me once, and that's really annoying as an author. Okay, so, and I've been aware, because when it comes back, you normally see the other the other reviewers' comments. I'm aware that in this case, I'm the only reviewer. Some journals, I've been one reviewer among 4. But in this case, I know that I am the only reviewer, and I believe the editor's just taking my word for whatever I say. So I took the decision to say this paper needs to go back one more time. And I really want to say to the authors, look, this is worth it. Right? I do imagine this will be published in the end. I'm just trying to strengthen it. I'm not just wasting your time. Okay? And I usually end it best wishes, but of course I don't put my name, unlike an email. Okay? And then you submit your recommendation to the editor, and then what happens is out of your hands. So you're in a position of power here, but so is the editor. It is the case I might send something for major revisions and I expect to get it back. And sometimes the editor just rejects. And other times the editor accepts it. Sometimes they might accept it as though it was a minor revisions and say to the authors, just change these things and then we'll accept it. And they never send it back to you again. So anything can happen, and you need to be clear you're making a recommendation. It's not actually your decision. Okay? And so long as you're aware of that from the beginning and you don't have the surprise, that won't be a problem. Some reviewers, and including me when I was inexperienced in this, they get a bit frustrated, especially if you see an article appear on a journal webpage that you sent back as major revisions, and you expected it back, and actually it's already been accepted. You can see it on the webpage. You know, that's happened to me. And the other thing is, sometimes I will say, look, this I'm going to say is major revisions, and I put in the comments to the editor box, I've put this as major revisions. I am happy to look at it again, but it is weak, and if you decide to reject it, I will not be surprised. That's actually the phrase I use. Okay. Okay, that's the end of this section. At the probably towards the very end of the session, we're going to talk briefly about the journal, because I talked about how important it is to know about aims and scope. So I do have a couple more slides, but we might come back to those at the end. Literally about 2 slides, but those are about the journal, Studies in Technology Enhanced Learning, that we're involved in setting up at the moment. So without further ado, I can hand over to Kyungmee.
We can do the little activity, but can we just see, just in case? I'm not really sure how high. All right, so I have sent email to all of you who are online right now, so you can get to, I think you have got 3 kind of files of PDF file. So you can see the first one called, I'm just going to get this right first. All right, so first of all, have you received an email from me? Yes, that's good. So we can start from original manuscript. So you don't have to open the other 2 yet, because it comes kind of in an order. So we thought about what we can do in terms of just giving some experience.
Sorry, Kyungmee, I don't know if I received it, and I don't know because I think Julie's cut off from the list of people. She's not on webcam, whether she might have got one, might have got the emails.
No, I didn't get it either, and I think we were missing it at the beginning, but it's fine. I've got to head off shortly anyway.
Where's Julie? Where is Julie? Can you see Julie? Oh, Tunda, you're there too.
Yeah, if you flick in between, you know, not everyone can fit on the screen,
okay,
so it's just...
All right, okay, I'll stop sharing. Oh, it's great, so I can see. Oh, that's great. I will forward this to Julie and Tunde. Sorry about that.
No problem. I just need to pop for 2 minutes and I'll come back.
What's happened there is, which we didn't realize, is when we're sharing the slides, you can only see maybe the top 4 people.
Yeah. Oh, it's not a problem. I just didn't get the email. Sorry, I won't be upset. I just get something.
All right, I'm working on it. But Julie, can I get your email address? You can turn on your microphone.
Is it easier if I just put it in the chat, or?
No, you can just tell me, because it comes up like with the several emails address on my.
All right. So it's julie.vos.
Yeah. Okay, I got it.
Yeah.
So that's good. So I have sent that all.
Do you want to just say who you are, Julie? Sorry if you were here at the beginning and I never asked you to. It was clear that you must have gone off the bottom of the screen on the.
I was making lunch and listening in, so it was fine. I'm Julie Vos. I'm the Head of Educational Technology at CTEL University in London, and I completed my PhD last year.
Hi, thanks, Julie.
Thank you. All right, so I have sent you all. So, okay, people in the room are trying to, they have a little break, but that's all right. So I was thinking what we can do. So I decided to share one of my very recent manuscript and the entire process of, the very first manuscript. Of course, got rejected from at least 5 different journals without even being sent out to the reviewers. I'm not going to share all those 5 because like the different reasons for editing to cut it off. But I have a couple of examples how my first manuscript was rejected by editor without really being reviewed by reviewers. And also it kind of went to 3 rounds of revision, which was so annoying. So I got first revision request as a major revision, and then of course I had to rework on it a bit of. You can see through the document that I'll share. So a lot of revision went through. And then it went out to the second review, and then you will see how reviewers are actually different reviewers. Except for the first reviewer, they just sent it to probably the other reviewers. They didn't want to do it again for some reason. So, and then they got back to me with different review outcomes in terms of, which is going to be discussed as one of the bad kind of example of being a reviewer. And then I had to rework on that or defend myself in terms of why I don't want to make an additional change on it. And then third time, eventually it got accepted, but with the condition of some more revisions. So it's the most kind of recent paper, just published in 2020. But for me, it took, you can see I submitted like 2018, so it took more than 2 years, and that was one of the kind of worst experience as an author that I had. But I just thought it may be interesting for you to look at what reviewers were saying. But before doing that, I want to give you probably 10 to 15 minutes. So to go through the original manuscript that I submitted, which was very first draft. And then I should say it's like of poor quality compared to my final outcome. But I want you to go through it, paper a little bit as if you're a reviewer, and can remember some of the comments made by Brett, although you wouldn't have time to do actual review thoroughly. But take a look at different section of paper and make kind of a brief judgment about yourself in terms of quality of paper and what kind of point that you would raise as a reviewer. So let's do that for like 10 to 15 minutes, and then I will share the results of the reviews that I got. Is it all right? Any questions so far? Lovely. So talk to you again in 15 minutes.
Do you resend them, Kyungmee?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, I haven't got any attachments on my email.
Oh, is it? Oh, that's silly. All right, I'm doing it again to Tunde and Julie. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I've
Am I
got
supposed
10 minutes anyway, but.
I don't have attachment. Okay, it has gone now. So in a couple of minutes, you may be able to receive it, hopefully. Just let me know if you haven't.
Thanks, they're attached now.
Lovely, thank you.
Hi, this is Julie. Just to say goodbye. Thanks very much for the session.
Bye, Julie.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Well, while we're saying goodbye, I need to go as well. Sorry, I have a
Bye.
meeting at
Bye,
2 o'clock.
Mac.
Thank you for this. I'm really enjoying reading the manuscript, so I'll take time to do that in more detail when I am a little bit later.
Yeah,
okay?
you can just take a pic of those nasty reviews.
Okay.
See you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Yeah. Sorry guys, I'll also be leaving in about 5 minutes because I have to deliver a workshop at 6. Over here in the UAE, it's actually 5:45 right now. I've got a workshop starting at 6 o'clock, so I'll be shooting off in about 5 minutes.
That's all right. Bye.
Before it started.
Just for Tandai, this
Yeah.
is an actual meeting that it's your first time to come and join us. It's great, but it's not really official meeting that we have. So it's going to be probably only May that we're going to get a actual business meeting that we can introduce you more officially to our members, and also kind of talk a little bit about the potential possibility of us working together that discussed just between two of us. So,
That's fine.
so you know.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. It's been great so far.
Wow.
Okay, nice to meet you for now.
Currently, the reviewers and the editor want me to have a major revision in this draft.
Yeah, I'll discuss that just for now. Just make your own judgment about that.
That's one reason we never know what the other reviewers are going to say, because it might affect our opinion.
Right.
So we can have roughly 3 more minutes to kind of go through it quickly. So if you can open the second file named Review Results, and that's where we're going to head down. But before kind of looking at it, actually, shall we kind of have a little, it's odd because it's my paper, but that's all right, I'm not going to be hurt. So you can just like frankly share roughly your opinions on the quality of the first draft. If you have any strong view on it. So I'll just open the floor for like probably a minute. If you have any comments on the initial manuscript, you can just kind of shout at, not me, but like the room. Yeah, I knew that no one is going to say anything clear. So let's just say that. How many do you think that? How many of you are thinking that it's going to be just accepted without any change? You can just raise your hand and we can just feel it.
Oh,
no, my supervisor doesn't count. All right, that's good, a good start. So how many of you think that it's kind of publishable with minor revision? Ooh.
I might have.
Really? All right, great. So, so Tunda, you're the strict reviewer.
No, sorry, I missed the brief and I was looking at not the original but the other documents. So I would. I just abstained from voting.
No, that's all right. So, okay, apparently, the journal has different system, but this journal, particular journal, doesn't have any strong and clear words saying minor revision or major revision. Some journal actually comes back to you to tell you this is minor revision accepted. But this journal didn't really use that word, but as you can see on the file that I share, the second file, it's quite a major revision that they kind of want I want me to do it. But the first page, let's just look at the first page. It's my old Gmail kind of very personal text that I have. But you can see the first, I've been trying to publish this paper from 2017, as you can see, 7 December 2017. It was not first rejection, but I tried internet education and distance education and computer and education and possibly like kind of good journal that you can think of. And then this is one of the example how it was all of them rejected it at the level of editorial process. So none of them has sent mine to reviewers. So you can see this distance education, the editor comes back to me saying, yeah, very shortly, this doesn't fit in the scope of this journal because as you can see, the reason is only because I focus on one institution, which is kind of, but like, you know, we can just discuss that, the legitimacy of like that kind of claim about, because as long as I know that most of our students here getting their entire PhD from focusing on one institution, most of them. So this is not very good reason for this editor to reject my paper in my view, but it really tells something about this editor's academic identity or his scholarship. You can just read it and then you can see what kind of papers will be much more appreciated by this editor. So this type of historical work, looking at the one institution historically, is not something that he thinks that very good enough to make any claim. So it got rejected for that reason. But that's all right. So I tried open learning. Eventually, it was my 6th attempt because for the same reason that Brett kind of mentioned, the scope of the journal, it's an open university journal. And this paper is all about Open University. Because this major journals focusing a lot on technology in general, think that this is too narrow scope. So I decided to go for open learning. And if they reject me, it's nowhere to go almost, I felt, because, you know, this is journal about open education and about open university. So I got it. And then apparently, as you can see, in terms of scope, it kind of fits. So the next page, the second page, you can read, you know, just the review. And I submitted this toward quite end of 2017 to open learning. And one thing that Brett mentioned, you can see the number of the manuscript. So the first line, it has manuscript ID COPL 2017 and 79. So it shows that not many people actually submitted their manuscript to GIST journal. It's not necessarily popular venue, for the same reason that it's very having narrow scope. So that's one thing that you can probably look at. And then given that they publish only less than 30 papers each year, so it may have like 30% acceptance rate for this journal, which is relatively easy. So nothing to be like so proud of myself. But anyway, so if you read that, you can see the editor kind of summarize editor just give you some direction and then kind of summarize the result of the paper. And then I want to jump to the reviewer one's comment. So I can give you a couple minutes to kind of read through quickly reviewer one's kind of review. So leave reviewer two just out of the site for now and just go through reviewer one's comment quickly, please.
Could I ask a question? If this the RD's response from this,
yeah.
Did you like make a change?
No, this is just original reviews based on the manuscript that you just read.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so, I mean, can you kind of recognize most of reviewers' comments, kind of based on your quick reading? Of course, it was not good enough in terms of time. So the first reviewer was, so, I mean, just to be clear, for all these reviewers, so four reviewers reviewed my paper at the end of the day, but none of them are very organized in terms of providing their review. They were a bit more like, but at least still, as you can see, it's for me, it's kind of substantial review. So if you come across a lot of reviewers just give you one paragraph without having any suggestions, I mean, it's very, very common because, I mean, given that how busy people are, they just do it, and then you just have that bit of criticism, but you can't really do anything using those reviews. So I'll say these two reviewers are quite organized, quite like sincere in a way that they try to really help and point things out, but they're not as organized as Brett kind of explain how he would do. But at the same time, I've never seen any reviewers very organized like Brett too. So no one's not giving me like taking that much time like Brett and crafting his review, Richard. So this is the best kind of review that I was able to get. But just like a side note.
Just one point, actually, though. What they've done here is they've put the substantial major points at the end and the minor points at the beginning in one way. Other than that, it does have some similarity with what I was talking about, but they've reversed my order.
Yeah. For me, he just sat down and kind of write as he goes. But anyway, or as she goes, it can be. So basically, most of the thing is kind of clarity, which is obvious, and he or she require a lot of more additional information about the context of research and like data collection method, and that's kind of all kind of doable. So for me, the first reviewer, what he was or she was asking was relatively easy. So for me, it was minor revision. A second review, I'll give another couple minutes to read second reviewer's reviews. For me, that was major revision requirement. So it took quite a long time for me to address his or her point. And again, he's or she's not very organized as well.
Sorry, everyone, I have to go to my next one. Thank you very much. That was really useful. I'll catch up with things later. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Okay, so for me, I was kind of suspicious that if he or she is actually a member of Lancaster University, because he seemed or she seems to be understanding what the process there. So he was kind of giving me feedback from the insider's perspective. So, and then a couple of things, I mean, it's very similar in a way that he or she also kind of, this reviewer also suggests things are not very clear, it's good. But one thing he pointed out, or she pointed out, okay, the reviewer pointed out that, which considered very major review is more clear and setting the definition of openness and innovation more clearly. That was a really big deal. So it was not as clear, I mean, as they're putting the simple definition, he wanted to see actual examples of innovation in UAU setting, so on. So it seemed quite easy when you can read as a reviewer's comment, but it was major review, very implicitly suggests that you have to, and then also both reviewer suggesting that my problem setting up in my first part of paper was not very convincing. Although they can see the value of my study, but it was very clear, both of them mentioned that the problem that I'm trying to deal with in the paper wasn't very clear. So they asked me to almost reframe or re-problematize entire research project in response to their comments. So now I know we are going quickly because we want to have the discussion time. But now, if you open the paper, last paper, final accepted paper, you can see. I have only four. Oh.
I can share it.
Yeah. Can I? So what happened after that is I want you to, if possible, if you can open the original manuscript and the final accepted manuscript together, side by side, and see what are the major things asked and then addressed thanks to reviewers' comments, is basically entire introduction was restructured and problem was banished, because originally I would say the complex relationship between two discourses, I kind of put that as the forward, kind of at the front as my actual problem. And then because that wasn't very convincing, as you can read later on of other reviewers' comments for the second round. Second round I tried, but similar comment from the new reviewer kicked in about the problem is a bit confusing. So eventually what have happened is I just put openness as the core thing that I want to unpack and challenge. And I was just putting exactly same study, but I just rewrite entire kind of problem, and I argue that openness discourse is problematic. I want to unpack, but best way to unpack that is you use Foucauldian kind of theory, for Foucauldian critical discourse analysis approach to put openness and innovation discourses together. So basically, like all these things has been reshaped. So that's why I felt like it was kind of major revision request. An entire methodology section is rewritten based on the reviewer's comment as well. So I'm not going to go through entire paper but what I wanted to point out is that if you read the reviewer's comments, especially, okay, so yeah, there are quite a changes made, but some are more of kind of apparent, some are more kind of, you know, you have to look at both documents more carefully. But basically, you can see the changes there. And I know it's kind of messy, but I want to redirect your attention back to the second PDF file, which is the collection of reviews. So now we kind of quickly look at the initial manuscript and then final manuscript based on the reviewer's comment, the first round reviewer's comment, which had the biggest impact upon the revision of this paper. And the next page, it has the heading of detailed responses to reviewers. Of course, this is not very relevant to the session directly, but it's the other side of the picture. But if you read how I respond, everyone has different kind of approach, but you can just feel how, like, I'm just trying to say a lot of things like, I'm so grateful, you're the best. I never really tried to argue against, because at the end of the day, there is 50% of possibility for this review paper go back to the original reviewer who reviewed it. So it's always better to appreciate his comments, although I'm not really addressing it fully. So you can, I just put it as example. Some of you, especially PhD students, may find it kind of useful later on. So I responded, and then I changed it, and then you can see another Gmail, like manuscript email text, January 20th, 2019. So the entire the first revision and the after first review took about a year. And the year after, I got like another comments of revision request. And then what you want to notice here is, although this journal is not very systematic, so it doesn't really give different name to each reviewer, but reviewer first, if you read his comment, it's the same person. So for example, if you read, so we're here, are you following me? So open learning, so this email text we are looking at, so it's review result on revised manuscript I submit. The R1 should be there. So first review, if you read it, this is a much improved article. He starts like that. So you can have like very clear clue that he did. So if you read his comment, he was very, very persistent in a way that some of his comment that he asked me to respond, I didn't, and I had my reason why not, but he was persistent and he asked it again. So he was like, it's a few things that he asked. Again, I ask you to look at, explain something, but it's still explain is short. Could you please do that? So this, I'm not personally doing it as a reviewer. For me, those small details, I gave reviews. request, and then if authors come back with the reason why he or she doesn't want to do it, I'm usually fine. But there are always these people who are a bit like, I don't know, I can't even remember how, I can't imagine how he remembers even my, what he pointed out. He must have enough time to go through his own comments and initial draft and change draft. So he was quite persistently asking me to do that. So eventually I had to address that because I kind of had a feeling that I wouldn't be able to go through it. But it really depends on reviewer. Some are more relaxed, some are not. And then second review, if you read it, the topic is interesting. The title suggests that the article, blah, blah, blah. This person, the entire first sentence gives you impression that this is new reviewer. So who didn't really read initial. And then one thing very annoying in terms of this second reviewer's comment is that it's kind of reversing some of the comment made by earlier reviewers who addressed it. So this is the thing that I'll try to be careful, because often I get a lot of review. Often I get the review request as the second review request on the revised version. And of course I have a lot to say, but I'm always trying to say within the scope of previous reviewers' comments, because I think it's really unfair to authors that I just read it as if I'm just new person walk into this room and try to smash all the things, that historical conversation between the first set of first reviewers and the author. And author put a lot of effort to address it. And then some of my comments I didn't mean that, but like unconsciously or kind of unintentionally kind of against. So that kind of took some of the strategic kind of approach for me to say, your idea is still good, but I'm not going to do it, or I had just made a minor comment. So the same thing happened. So I did that. And then third one, if you look at the last page, this last email, this is final acceptance letter with current revision request. So that's why, especially reviewer one here, I could see what I really wanted to meet him or her in real life, because he still accepted, and he kept saying this article is well written and very great, but he's persistently asking even this, but it's quite minor degree of thing. But although I'm saying this quite annoying, but I do actually really appreciate this person, and I feel like this kind of entire manuscript was shaped by him partially or her partially. So again, it's very lucky situation. You got the one reviewer who is persistently interested in your work and trying to give you feedback. Sometimes it's not really the way that you would you will necessarily write your own paper, but I kind of really feel, at least this one person should be acknowledged. So that's the thing. So, and then the second reviewer somehow comes in again, is like a new person. So I think the open learning itself is not like the best journal in the field or anything like that. I think this journal itself is struggling to get the reviewers. So the policies, they need to really have two people fully say accepted without having any revision, and that's the only way that they can publish paper. But it's kind of having those two reviewers seems to be a bit difficult at the moment. But anyway, second reviewer, but I really appreciate this reviewer is that he is clear that he has read the others reviewers already, reviews. So he has a line, the author seems to have tackled, so you can see the sign. Most of the critical remarks already presented by previous reviewers were satisfactorily addressed. Well, I don't know that word. But anyway, so it's kind of, it says, I think for me, this is one of the etiquette that you should just really pursue as a reviewer when you get the chance to review somebody's revised version of manuscript. So anyway, at the end of that, it was happy kind of acceptance, but you can see, so for me, the way that I'm just adding simply to what Brett is just explaining before, is that for me, because the nature of my study is very qualitative and it's a bit critical, I try to say things much more not very prevailing in the field. that I can't simply just put a lot of references to support myself. My article always like come across quite very different, but also a bit like not necessarily philosophical, but use a bit of social theory on. So it's not very easy for me getting the first revision and second revision, getting this many set of reviews is actually very common. None of my paper has been published like this, or even after one revision, it also get a major revision request again. So so for me, how I see this process is really conversation. And sometimes this kind of review style, which is not very organized in one sense, but I really like when it's really conversational. So it's a bit like, it's not very structured, or it's not very kind of try to teach me what to do, but it's very kind of organically this person reading my paper and try to engage with my idea, which is rather different from probably other people would say in the field, but try to really say things, ask questions basically. This part is very not clear type of thing. And then I respond that. So it's almost like almost three sets of conversation back and forth between between those unknown reviewers I've never really met. I will never really know who they are in person. I think it's a really good opportunity for me as an author, and also the other side as a reviewer too. It's really awesome kind of, although it's a lot of work, but awesome opportunity for me to be able to talk to authors in this kind of free way that I can just tell him, especially when article is good and the ideas are interesting. And I often find myself writing quite long kind of review, couple pages, almost like trying to engage in conversation, and I learn a great deal. But anyway, this is just a sample that I want to share, and then you can just like take a look, and we will kind of have last part of the kind of session recapping some of the things and introducing our journal to people. But before that, we're going to have some discussion, because I know all of you may have some question or some experiences that you want to share with us too. So so let's kind of open up little kind of space to have a little discussion, and is anything that kind of burden kind of issues that you want to also kind of talk to us and together. So that can be it. Thank you. So shall we just like kind of start with Maria? I know that Maria, you already posed your question in your email. Oh.
Yes, I have myself both positive and negative experiences. But I suppose, as any other thing, it's
Sorry. I think.
Can you get it back?
Yeah, I think. Oh shit.
that at times let me speak about my experience as an author. Well, I've passed through some of the things you were mentioning in your while relating this story. Something that at one time really bugged me as an author was that, for example, you come with reviewers, you're doing one methodology, especially in my case, I'm doing phenomenography, and at times you find that it is misinterpreted for phenomenology. And considering what Brett earlier was referring to as the power relations, as an author, you feel sort of helpless. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Maria, could you just repeat the thing you said after power relations?
Yeah, for example, one of my what I felt as a very bad experience for me was I had a paper on which eventually got published, but the earlier reviewers were mistaken phenomenography for phenomenology. And as an author, when you get the reviewers' comments and you see them all addressing phenomenology and not the methodology you are using, and they're actually writing comments directed at that very thing, you know, there isn't much I feel you can do as an author, and it reflects what Brett was saying earlier about the power relations in this peer reviewing activity. I don't know if you have any comments.
I mean, one of the things, of course, is editors should be selecting reviewers who ought to be somewhat sympathetic. And if that hasn't happened, there's a problem. But as Kyungmee's pointed out, sometimes editors actually struggle to get peer reviewers. It's not actually an easy thing to do. So I think as a peer reviewer, which is, I mean, you see in part your issue there is from the perspective of the author. But from the perspective of a peer reviewer who's just been given that paper, I'd like to think that those people would be, you know, trying to be as sympathetic as possible and trying to consider that they're trying to help you do your work. The thing about being an author in that situation is you do have to realize that you do always have a choice. So if a peer reviewer gives you feedback that you don't want to do, so for example, they're trying to make out that you're suddenly doing phenomenology when you're not. Well, one of your options is to rewrite your paper how you think, and then to say so in the comments back to the reviewers, which is the kind of document that Kyungmee was showing. And the other option is, and you might have to do this anyway, even if you take option one, you might have to do this later. The other option is to simply withdraw the paper and send it to another journal. So there are very, you know, you're an author in a market, just as the journal is in a market, and in effect, you're trying to find a good partnership between your work and a journal. And if there's a journal just saying, as indeed that first journal said to Kyungmee, well, you've only covered one site and we're not going to consider that, then you just leave it and think that's just not, that editor and I, in that case it's the editor, are just not on the same wavelength, and that, at least for this piece of work, that can't be bridged. Yeah. So we'll just go for another journal, you know. And that really is a legitimate thing, and it's one of the other reasons why I try and provide helpful feedback even when it's on rejection as well, because obviously that author is going to go to another journal. That's kind of what they're being told. So there's the perspective issues that I mentioned earlier, but basically the final solution might be another journal. Yeah. Well, it sounds in your case like that's not what had to happen. You did eventually push it through.
Actually, the paper was actually rejected, and I did go to another journal which accepted it. I did use some of the review comments of the earlier submission. I did use them to sort of upgrade the paper. But then, as for example, Kyungmee was pointing out that at times you get reviewers contradicting the comments of others, and sort of what am I going to do? So you end up, as you were saying, that you take a stand, and all right, you are responding to the reviewers' comments, but at the same time, you are justifying each and every step you're doing, and at times even rejecting what they are saying, but giving reasons why you are not reacting to what they want you to do. And normally I found it that that to be acceptable. So I do appreciate the reviewers' comments, and most of the time I do see them as helping you to improve the quality of the article, and in that sense it's also a sort of an emotional roller coaster, but because at the end you're much happier with what you have, and all thanks to the reviewers' comments. So
I have actually had one situation where a reviewer sent me some comments that I thought were a bit silly, and I was going to reject them, and then I was going to say why back to the reviewer, and then in writing the reason why, in actually writing it down, I realized it wasn't such a bad comment. And it made me change the paper, not drastically, but it made me, what it actually made me do was to explain something much more clearly.
I mean, for the section's perspective, I think what we can get out of your experience, Maria, and then other people will be helpful, is that really kind of, you know, we're reviewing the outcome of the research. We're not reviewing the confirmation document or research proposal here. So I think what the reviewer that you kind of unfortunately came across, his mistake is he's trying to almost reshape your study stuff. So like that, for me, that's not acceptable, because I have already done critical discourse analysis and I want to report it. So you can suggest different way for me to make my methodological description clearer, all sorts of things. But you can't only ask me to, critical discourse analysis is not a good methodology that you can use for this problem. I think you just have to use interview study. I mean, that's, so for me, that's not right. I think that's totally reviewers misbehaving, and he's really, in terms of power relationship, I think he is really crossing the line and not really aware of being aware of what his role is in this context. So the scope of, I think Brett mentioned a similar thing, that although he likes one approach of research, but he's not going to be in the position of telling or suggesting people to change research approach. It's like all done deal. Research has been done. It has been completed, no matter with that, like, yeah, whether it's quality or like bad quality, that's different issue. But only thing that we can almost do here is like helping people to be able to report it more effectively, so that people can read it, understand things more clearly, rather than go and study again. That's but for me, that I'll never do that.
But to benefit of the doubt as well, even when I talk to people, phenomenography is very, very often misunderstood for phenomenology. So it's, I personally, I wasn't interpreting it as someone trying to impose on me another strategy to my research. Actually, I was interpreting it more that there was this conundrum I come across several times, and I can see why several authors have went into a lot of effort to try to distinguish between these two different strategies in the interpretative paradigm. So I'm not so sure that the reviewer was trying to impose their own way of doing things. It might be, but
well, no, I mean, I think, yeah, that can be simple misunderstanding. Okay. All right, shall we kind of, do you have any, I mean, other people will have any other questions or kind of comments?
And I've got quite a nice problem in a way. I submitted a journal and the editor sent it to some reviewers, and they all sent it back saying, yeah, it's all very well, but if we publish this, everybody who reads our journal will just say, yes, we know. So he was really kind enough to provide me with the feedback, and he said, you know, in his opening sort of gambit, he said, don't take this the wrong way. This is not going to go into our journal, but we thought you might appreciate the feedback as if it would have been accepted for the journal. And he just said, and he was kind enough to say as well, I'm not even sure there's a journal out there that it's suited to, but it's all very interesting. Try and find one that's to do with military pedagogy, but I can't think of one. In a way it was lovely, but in another way it was infuriating.
Well, okay.
It doesn't add much value to the current discussion. I just thought you might be interested too.
I guess the issue is you're setting up, I don't know, I haven't seen that article, although I can imagine the kind of thing it might be about. You're kind of setting it up as being a genuine problem in practice and a sort of gap in the scholarship. And that's I think what the editor might be saying there is odd, which is not just that you haven't done that in the current draft, but he's worried that that's impossible. That's a fairly strong claim. I haven't seen that before, but yeah, okay. But it does actually, one of the things I was going to say when people were talking about, oh, different reviewers said different things or people misunderstood, the editor's role is quite an active mediator. You know, I mean, with this session is about peer reviewing, you know, in effect writing the peer reviews, but the editor has a very, very big role here and is a very big agent in this process, and that's clearly what he's done there. Although usually the editor is more kind than the peer reviewers. In your case, it seems the peer reviewers like it and the editor just doesn't want it in, which is kind of, that is unusual.
I did get the impression, it was Soljo, but I got the impression from his comments as well, he did like it. I sincerely thought his readership will kind of read it and say, yeah, we empathise with you and we know, but what was the point of writing? It was basically about tensions between a sort of activity theory approach to development and kind of drill and practice approaches, try and drill and practice approaches in higher education, military, and you know, you can the sort of stuff that was.
All right, good luck with next submission then. You may have the little section of contribution of this paper to make it even more clear.
Shall I just do?
All right.
Can I just sit there? Okay, we're at the time now where the session's going to draw to a close. So I just wanted to make 1 minute's worth of points, and I don't, for whatever reason to do with technology, my start bar has crashed on this computer, so I'm going to not get the slide back up because I don't know how to. I don't want to stop Zoom in case that literally kills the meeting. The 2 points I wanted to make are actually fairly simple. I probably don't need slides. We're involved in creating a new journal called Studies in Technology Enhanced Learning. Part of the reason for hosting this session is triggered by that. And part of the hope is that we might get some people who've come to this session to actually do some reviewing. There are two things worth noting about that journal. There's a lot of interesting things about it, but from the current perspective, I just want to focus on two. The first is part of the explicit aims and scope of the journal is to provide materials that will be accessible to PhD students. And it might be that they're actually written by PhD students, but many of them won't be. But, you know, there's a lot of stuff about how much knowledge is being assumed. That even came up, I read it in one of the reviews to Kyungmee's article, things were being assumed that actually a reader might not know. So explicitly, we want the articles to be readable by a PhD student. Even if that means that in explaining something in a bit more detail, you take more words. It's going to be an online journal. We don't have a need for a strict word count. We want to be really accessible in the sense of somebody who's a first-year PhD student could read that. Now, when we talk about who the reviewers are, and this is a session for PhD students and early career researchers, right? Early career researchers still can kind of remember being PhD students usually, right? It's not that many years off. You being a PhD student is itself a valuable resource, okay? Who can say whether something is legible by a PhD student better than a PhD student or a recent PhD student, right? There's a whole host of other things in the aim and scope, which talk about what the journal's about, but it's not very surprising for current purposes. The other thing, which is the second point I just want to make, though, is I mentioned at the start about novel approaches to peer reviewing, and there are lots of different models. In many ways, what we're going to do is fairly standard, which is when you read a paper, you won't at that point know who the authors are, and they won't know who you are. If you do a peer review and the paper gets accepted, that's important, then later you will be offered the opportunity to write a follow-on response. So this is what I thought of it, or this is how I think this work could go forward, or this is an alternative way of looking at this same situation, something that occurred to me. And of course, at that point, when the papers are published, not only will you finally know who the authors of the paper are, but they will know the names of the reviewers who accepted the challenge of writing a response. You don't have to write a response. You might hate the paper. You might not have time. You might not know how to respond, but the opportunity will be offered. And because we can't have like responses being peer reviewed and then writing responses, right? You could see how that could go on for infinite regress. No, those won't be peer reviewed, although the editors will just quickly check them over, and they will be marked in the journal on the front page. There'll be a thing in this journal that says peer reviewed : and it will say either yes or no, and it will say yes for all the articles and no for the responses and the editorials and things like that. And that's, you know, I'm not saying we're definitely not the first people in the world to do that, but it's not common. So those are the two things. So hopefully, if you've attended this session, we might call on you, and that might give you a bit of impetus to say yes. Because as we have discussed, getting peer reviewers, not always the easiest thing in the world. And it's not that it's not valuable, and I don't think anybody thinks it's not valuable. It's just that there are so many papers around, and so many, once you get into it, once you start getting invited, there can become a time when there's more invitations than you've got time to do. And so on average, there's a lot of people having to say no a lot of the times, you know, and that's all. Okay. So that's all I had to say. Oh, thank you.
So let's just...
I'm happy to close the session unless anyone has any parting words, but I hope that was vaguely useful, and we can see some nice, overly organized, according to Kyungmee, peer reviews.
Don't worry, just conversation on mana, like bullet points are all right.
Okay.
Okay. Have a good, thanks for coming, Mary and Phil. Have a good day. See you around.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, thanks.